Test the claim.
Zarathustra and the serpent in the garden, and Prometheus, and their attempts to equip mankind with knowledge, ergo, technology, but really the ability to be able to influence the outcome of their own destiny. That's kind of bringing me on to like where I wanted to go with this. The influence of Zoroastrianism on the Abrahamic traditions, which is where we started way back when I said it's a tradition outside of the Abrahamic tradition, but one that influenced it quite heavily. So I would argue that there comes a point in time, specifically like in the Jewish tradition, where Zoroastrianism, or people bringing Zoroastrianism with them, reformed the Jewish tradition. So there are a number of religious themes that didn't exist in Judaism until a particular phase in their history. And that would be the post-exilic era. So they were held captive in Babylon for 70 years or so. Once they were released from captivity there were a number of...
Cyrus?
That's my namesake, by the way. So there are a number of new themes to enter or become well developed in the Jewish tradition that had never really existed before. So, for example, this devil figure, this opponent to God's law, who had previously just been I would almost say that Satan had been almost like one of Yahweh's team members, like in Job, where he's actually advising God.
He was an employer. He was on God's team.
He was on the team.
Yeah.
He was part of the prosecution team.
He was his main guy.
Yeah.
God says it quite a few times.
He was an advisor.
God held him to the highest esteem of all the angels.
Right. But it's only later on that he becomes an opponent. So, as I described, this what became considered a being in Zoroastrianism, Angramenu, the constrained mentality. This trope began to become mimicked by the Satan of the Abrahamic tradition, but behind this was the emergence of a number of rabbinical sects in Judaism. So post-exile, you had the emergence of the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Pharisees. Now, if you ask a Hebrew speaker or someone who's versed in the Jewish tradition who the Pharisees are, or what the word Pharisee means, first of all, if you ask them who they are, they'll say they're the rabbis. They're the custodians of the Jewish tradition. And then you ask what the word Pharisee means, and in this context, they'll tell you that the word Pharisee comes from Perushim, which it derives from a Greek word which means separatist. But actually, in Hebrew, the word Pharisee translates as Persian. If you put Persian, the word Persian, into Google Translate, the word it comes out with is Pharisee. We might be able to ask someone in a bit. So my claim there, or the case that I'm building is, it's the Pharisees who began to develop these eschatological ideas about an end of days, angelology and demons, judgment after death, reward and punishment, heaven and hell. These were all ideas that were new to the Jewish tradition at this point. For example, when you die, prior to these new ideas, when you die, you just go to Sheol, a place where the souls just wander and linger around. There's no punishment and reward per se.
They have the resurrection idea.
So,
Came in at some point.
No. I'm saying that these ideas were Zoroastrian ideas. That this sect of rabbis called the Pharisees developed within the Jewish tradition. Sorry.
Something to note is obviously at the time the New Testament the issues between, because at that point Israel is like in between a very serious rivalry between Rome and Persia, which is
At which point in time? The point in time, the phase in time that I'm talking about is prior to the emergence of Rome.
But I'm talking like at the time of the New Testament.
Oh, New Testament, yeah.
Which is when the Pharisees, obviously, you hear about the Pharisees
Yeah.
and the relationship between the Jewish people and the Pharisees. Obviously, that was the rivalry between Rome and Persia was very critical to the circumstances at the time, because obviously Israel had been annexed by Rome, and they had put Herod in as the king of the time, specifically to prevent any further close relationships between Persia and Israel.
Yeah.
Which is...
That sounds plausible. Let me ask you, do you know which sect of rabbis were like most powerful under Roman rule? So was it because I know there was like this struggle between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees being like the temple rabbis, the kind of very like conservative traditionalist views, and then the Pharisees who were the ones developing these kind of seemingly new ideas.
Yeah.
So do you know what the balance of power was during Roman rule?
Well, okay, so the Pharisees had the power over the common people's ideas.
Right.
People didn't like the Sadducees because, one, they supported the Roman occupation and they supported the Greek ideas.
Right.
They were in bed with the Romans and the Greeks, and they supported importing resources from Rome and Greek. And even though they were very conservative, secretly they would tax on behalf to support the Roman occupation, which helped a lot of Jewish people. No, it put a lot of Jewish people in poverty. So no one liked the Sadducees. The Pharisees were seen as very, very friendly because they were seen as you say, the more progressive ideas. They were people who embodied the more people-friendly kind of ideas of Judaism that didn't appeal to...
Well, of course, they were probably the ones propounding the idea of like heavenly reward for good behavior.
All
right?
of those ideas that you're talking about, they were associated with the Pharisees, like the Messiah, resurrection. All of those ideas were given and taught by the Pharisees and not the Sadducees. They were more involved in like the legalistic side of Judaism.
Right.
Even though they would not really follow it themselves.
Right.
So they were seen as very hypocritical.
Right.
Hence, the big issue within the start of the New Testament is the fact that you have Israel, who is very, very, very ideologically, politically close with Persia, who's otherwise being annexed by force by the Roman Empire to prevent any further close relationships. And so Israel is in the middle of a proxy war, and it's tearing the country apart, and that's what the setting for the New Testament actually is. So it's
I would even, to be honest with you, total comment from left field, but I would even argue that the emergence of Islam came about in a similar milieu, as in the Arabian Peninsula became the subject of this kind of borderland war between the Romans and the Persians in its day, and very conveniently another religious tradition sprouted up in the middle of that. But I think it's kind of very difficult to ignore that wider battle of superpowers that was going on in the region.
It's very important because obviously the Jews, you don't necessarily hear about the Jews who were spread out in Persia at the time.
Right.
Especially in the time of the New Testament, you already had Alexander the Great who already annexed Israel beforehand, so you get a lot of the Jews who were already spread out into the Roman world, which made it very easy. And the Jewish people were very productive, very, very, they were very valuable people that, from the point of view of a Roman, you don't really want them contributing to your biggest imperial rivals. So it's important.
Yes, a national security risk.
Yeah. So
there's a Professor Robert M. Price, who's actually a New Testament scholar, as well as I don't know what his other PhD is in, but he goes as far as saying that the Pharisees are, quote, the Zoroastrian rabbis. or the Zoroastrian Jews. That's how confident he is about the influence. But you have to remember, Ezra, who was charged with going back to the Holy Land and teaching the law, the prophet Daniel, so Ezra, Nehemiah, the prophet Daniel, Jeremiah, they were all Persian governors. They were Jews, but they were all employed by the Persian kings of their time. So the idea that they weren't somehow like I consider them almost like Trojan horses for religious themes of Persian origin. So, for example, I would even go so far as to say that it's this influence that made Judaism monotheistic. For example, in the same chapter where we're introduced to Cyrus the Great, and where he is named the Messiah, or he is named Messiah, not the Messiah. There's no definite article in the Hebrew language, but where he is named his anointed, God's anointed.
No, Messiah also means savior. So he would save them from their bondage.
Yes, so very famously, Cyrus freed the captives from Babylon.
Yeah.
But in the same chapter, Isaiah speaks in the voice of God. It's God speaking in the first person, where for the first time this explicit statement of monotheism, i.e., there are no other gods, is spoken for the first time.
Wait. Doesn't the Ten Commandments say that in Moses' time?
It doesn't say there are no other gods. It just says, "Thou shalt not take any other gods."
It seems more of a competition.
Your Lord is one. That is in the Old Testament. That's before this statement. So I think you might be overstating that point a little
Something
bit.
to consider is obviously that was also written in retrospect.
Which part?
The Ten Commandments. That was also written in retrospect. So it's hard to divorce those writings, as you say. It's very hard to divorce them from the historical influence.
Yeah. First of all, ancient Israelite religion is one of a landscape of gods. I agree that Judaism became monotheistic, but I think it came from a henotheistic or monolatrous origin.
Okay, so the beginning of Judaism is from Abraham,
Okay.
who was born into a polytheistic family,
Yeah.
and then he rebelled against that polytheism, and God said, "Leave your father's home,
Yeah.
and I will show you the land I will give you." That person is the first archetype of the Judaism is where it comes from. Because of the covenant that God had with Abraham, there was circumcision. Now that's the main theme. If you make like a deal of blood and you cut your hand and shake hands, that's a blood contract,
Like a
right?
pact, yeah.
Pact. So that's the contract was sealed with the circumcision.
Right.
That is like you cut this, you're going to have a deal, and you're going to do all your generations are going to do that for me, one person, one God, Yahweh, the Elohim. That's it.
I got you.
So I'm just saying, you might be overstating that point when it comes to they got the idea from Zoroastrians.
Well, I'm sure we can argue that. We can argue that sometime. I'll make my case there. But that's kind of
I think historically what you're saying is
like, for example, in Exodus, I think it's Exodus 15, where Moses is singing to God. He says, "Who, O Lord, who, O Elohim, is like you amongst the Baalim?" So who, O Lord, is like you amongst the gods?
Yeah.
That is a failure, in my opinion, to rule out the existence of other gods. So it's tantamount to acknowledgement that they exist, but that he is only to take one for himself. Yeah, that Moses only accepts one God for himself. But that's not explicit monotheism. It's like, I think it's monolatry, where you accept or you fail to rule out the existence of other gods, but you accept that there is only one for you. Yeah?
I mean,
it's a subtle.
in Exodus is quite an interesting example on this point, particularly because obviously the whole thing with Egypt, with God destroying Egypt, like obviously there is the theory, but I'm a believer of this particular theory that the specific plagues that he brings on addresses certain gods in Egypt.
Right.
And
Like the plagues are analogous.
Yeah,
like each
yeah.
plague is analogous with an Egyptian god,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
Egyptian
to the
divinity.
Egyptian gods, and stuff like that. And it's just
That's
like,
interesting.
it was a competition between like
Almost like
gods.
like as one plague would come in, it would be putting to the sword that divinity, that Egyptian divinity.
And that's quite a consistent. It's a very, very widespread theory. I'm a believer of this theory. But there is
I'm just going to sort my lighting out while you continue.
there's a slight